We are taking a look at configuring IP addressing on different devices. Find out more next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
IP addresses are great, but where do we actually use them? Well, this guy right here knows. All right, Wes, when we start talking about the idea of IP addressing that we actually have done in a previous episode, we do need to know where in the world do we put these IP addresses to use them effectively. So, Wes, how are we going to demonstrate this?
One of the things I thought would be great for everybody to see out there is just to be able to see where we go to configure these IP addresses and then just have a discussion around that.
Sounds great. Why don't we head on over to the bench?
All right, everyone, come on over here and join me. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to use one of the computers that we've been using throughout this series. In this case, it's going to be a server. So let's hop right in. One of the ways that I'm going to do, I'm going to find our network adapter, because that's where we're going to be configuring. Remember that your IP addressing, it's all part of what they call the TCP/IP properties of the network adapter. And there's many different ways that you can find the properties of the network adapter, but I'm going to go ahead and I'll show you one way. I'm just going to use the search field here and I'm going to type out, well, I didn't even have to get that far. I was going to type network connections, but you could see I got NE and it came up right away. So I'm going to go ahead and just type network there, just so I don't have to be so lazy. But you can type network connections. The instant search field is kind of getting really, really intuitive. And we're going to go ahead and we'll click that. And that's going to bring up our network connections dialog box here. This is what we want to have a discussion about, right? Because this is our network adapter that is in this server. And if I right-click on the network adapter, I can do a couple of things here. I can choose status if I want. And if I choose status, I can review what are the current status, if you will, about our network adapter, right? I can see if there's IPv4 connectivity. Now, it's interesting. It says it has no network access, IPv6 connectivity, no network access. So we got some issues that we have to address here. Haha, you like what I did there, right? And we'll go ahead and one of the great ways, Ronnie, we can get a heads up, real quick heads up view on the configuration properties of the network adapter is to choose details. And if we choose details and we kind of look at some of the information here, you'll see that we've got various information about the configuration of our network adapter. Notice here we've got what's known as a physical address in the Microsoft world. That's actually a MAC address. The MAC address, if you will, is a 6-byte, 48-bit address that uniquely identifies the network adapter itself. And we can also see that we've got DHCP enabled. Now, Ronnie, do you notice something about DHCP? Our IPv4 address,
Yes.
What do you notice about that address?
Yeah, that is not one that looks like it would be valid on any network except if you're actually doing the APIPA address.
That's right. So one of the things that I can tell from this, and let me zoom in a little bit more, is that if DHCP is enabled, my computer should be calling out to the network and saying, hey, somebody out there, give me an IP address. Well, unfortunately, there were crickets, and our DHCP server apparently is snoozing because there was no response. And I want you to understand that it fell back on an automatic configuration, that APIPA configuration, and notice the format of the APIP address. 169.254, and then the last two octets were generated by the computer. So this is a way that we can get kind of a high-level view of our properties of our network adapter. But if we want to make configurations, I'm going to go ahead and close this box out. And I'm also going to close this dialog box, but I want you to know that I could choose properties here, but I want to show you another way that you can do this too. So if I close this dialog box down and I can right-click on the network adapter again and I just choose properties, it'll bring up the same dialog box, a couple different ways to get the same exact thing. All right, and these are the protocols and the technologies, if you will, that the connection uses. And the ones that we really want to kind of dive into are IPv4 and IPv6. Now, how does this affect us? Well, let's go ahead and let's look at the IPv4 properties first. Now, I'm kind of abbreviating that. it actually spells it out. Internet Protocol version 4, but we don't say that here in IT. We abbreviate everything and turn everything into acronyms, so I'm going to say IPv4, and we're going to choose properties. Let me kind of zoom out here, and I can see that yes, this network adapter is configured to obtain an IP address dynamically, right? Dynamic addressing, remember, is our DHCP server handing out an IP address. Now, where did the APIPA configuration come from? Well, that's a default configuration, and that comes from the alternate configuration tab right here. And if I choose alternate configuration tab, we can see that by default, your computer is configured, and this is a default in Windows, to have an APIPA address. Now, I could choose an alternate configuration here, but that's beyond the scope of this episode. So, if I want to statically assign an address, right? Static means that I manually set it and it doesn't change until I come back and make modifications to it, then I'm going to have to change the setting on the General tab. And Ronnie, I want you to notice something that kind of happens when I change from obtain an IP address automatically to use the following. Notice that alternate configuration tab disappears, right? And that's because if you are statically setting an IP address, you don't need an alternate configuration tab because you're saying use this IP address. And that's what we're going to do here. Now, there are a few things that we have to set up when you're configuring an IPv4 address. All right, you have to set your IP address, and I'm going to use what I typically have this server configured as. And in full transparency, everyone out there, servers typically have static addresses. I wanted to show you what it would look like if you were looking at the properties of the network adapter and you didn't see a static configuration. What would that look like? Well, we've just kind of reviewed that. So I'm going to set the IP address, IPv4 address. Now the subnet mask, when I click that, it applies the default subnet mask. This is just a default. I can configure this any way I want. However, the catch is, if I want this computer to be on the same network as the other computers that are in the 10.10.10 network, they also have to have the same exact subnet mask. Remember, because that's what defines what network you're on. So I use a 255.255.255.0. Let's talk briefly about the gateway. Well, what's a default gateway? Well, the gateway is really nothing more than the door leading out of your local network to another network. All right, a gateway off of your network. And typically for us, that's the router. The router out there that allows us to send information to it, and it can determine how to get that information across remote networks. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set my default gateway. My default gateway, by the way, also has to be on the same network or I can't communicate with it. Next, we have our DNS servers, all right? And you can choose your DNS servers that you want to statically assign as well. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use Google's DNS servers. So we have 8.8.8.8, and I'm going to use 8.8.4.4. All right, and when we do this, we can choose OK, and then choose Close. And if we review our settings here, and we can do this by just simply right-clicking on our network adapters icon and choosing Status, and then choosing Details, notice how the configuration changes, right? Notice that it says DHCP is not enabled. Notice that we have an IPv4 address. There's our address. Notice that we have an IPv4 subnet mask. It defines what network we're on. We have a default gateway. Who do we send? Which device do we send? In this case, it's an IP address of the device. Who do we send that to when it isn't bound for our local network? Well, we send it to the default gateway. And then finally, we have our IPv4 DNS servers. Ronnie, this is how you set up your IPv4 configuration. But we're not done. Because one of the things we also wanted to talk briefly about is IPv6, right? Well, you can set IPv6 here. Let's go ahead, let's cancel this, and I'm going to choose properties from this location, and you can see, did the same thing out there, everyone. It just a couple different ways to get to the same location at the end of the day. All right, and we have Internet Protocol version 6, and we can choose properties. Now, notice that, and this is a common setting here in today's networks, obtain an IPv6 address automatically. Now, what's great about IPv6 is I don't have an IPv6 DHCP server out there. In this configuration, the network adapter can actually generate its IPv6 address. Now, we could use a DHCP v6 server, but that's beyond the scope of this course. Keep in mind that this is where you would set your IPv6 settings, and if you wanted to do static assignment, you can also do static assignment on IPv6 as well. Now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to leave this the way it was, and I will go ahead and cancel out. Ladies and gentlemen, this is how you do IPv4 and IPv6 address configuration. A piece of advice is if you're on a certification exam endeavor, I would memorize the way to get to these locations. Just keep it in your memory. If you're in a support desk role, I would do the same thing, because remember that when you're supporting end users, a lot of times they don't know these locations. But you have to know these locations, and sometimes you have to know them by memory. So remember, regardless whether it's certification endeavor or a support endeavor, at the end of the day, if you can do IPv4 and IPv6 address configuration, it's going to make you a lot more successful in your career.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.